Ask anyone and they'll tell you, if you can remember the 60s, then you weren't there. It becomes obvious why when you think about all the things that happened during this decade. It's no surprise they called it the swinging 60s. From a tolerance of sex and violence in films to the liberation of women from kitchens nationwide thanks to innovation in household products and drugs, the pill as we know it today was first approved by the FDA in 1960, and it was later issued by the NHS in 1961, although back then you still had to pay for it. As if this didn't cause enough protest and outcry among the older generations, the first silicone breast implants were performed in 1962, meaning that augmentations were about more than just reconstructive surgery. Other places women were being acknowledged included the Hollywood Walk of Fame. It was officially opened with Joan Woodward rumoured to be the first actress to receive a star. 1961 saw the birth of the TV show The Avengers. John Steed's sidekick, the sheer definition of style, is sleek, sexy, sassy, and ultimately trained in combat. This female liberation was pushed further into fruition by Mary Quant, designer of the miniskirt. By 1966, everyone was wearing her creation, which had also inspired the mini dress, microskirt, and by the end of the 60s, hot pants. All of these are still in fashion to this day. Jean Shrimpton, who was considered to be one of the world's first supermodels, helped launch the miniskirt in 1965. Jean Shrimpton, whilst a still relatively unknown model, met and started a relationship with photographer David Bailey in 1960. He's often credited for being an influence in her career, and in turn, Shrimpton became his muse. Along with fellow photographers Terence Donovan and Brian Duffy, Bailey helped to capture the essence of swinging London by hiring a group of models, supplying drink and drugs, and photographing them on the streets. Together they changed the face of fashion photography from the highbrow of the 50s to the sassy, bright, and liberated face of the 60s. Essentially, they were the beginnings of celebrity photographers. Another iconic image, this time from 1963, was that of Christine Keeler, another model who posed naked to promote a film. The chair that she was sitting on in the photo was made from polypropylene plastic, a new invention by Robin Day. 20 million of those stacking chairs have since been produced. The introduction of the chair changed the process of using textiles for seating and would have gone on to inspire the likes of the love chair. The 60s saw the breakdown of the social classes, and what was considered acceptable was evolving. Criminals were being glorified like the Cray twins in Bailey's box of pin-ups, a set of 36 black and white photographic prints that were sold in a box. It was considered an unusual and unique way of selling photography, and due to the nature of the photographs and the models shown in it, it was strongly opposed and no second edition ever appeared. So strong was the opposition that no edition of the box ever appeared in America. This change was also being reflected in film. Pushing aside the 50s aliens and monsters was a wave of psychological horrors. These were terrifying because of their potential realism. Hitchcock's Psycho, which was released in 1960, shook audiences with its violent and previously unseen sexual nature. It became suddenly apparent that there could be a Norman Bates on your very street. Mental illness was also addressed in these films, a previously unacceptable topic in most households. A slightly lesser-known director, Michael Powell, was doing just that by portraying serial killer and voyeur Mark Lewis, who stalked and murdered women whilst filming it all on his camera. With the use of suspenseful music and later a fantastic use of green screen in the 1963 Hitchcock hit The Birds, these directors gave birth to a new wave of suspense horrors, films that stay with you long after the credits have finished rolling. TV shows and animations were all changing around this time too. 1960 not only saw the first episode of Coronation Street aired, which went on to become the world's longest-running soap, but the first interracial kiss is shown on the newly introduced
Space,
Star Trek.
the final frontier.
Flintstones was the first animation to be broadcast on primetime TV. Thunderbirds and Tom and Jerry followed suit in 1964, and a new genre of TV was born, evolving through to the animations we know and love today. Another topic that spans the entire decade is famously known as the space race, as countries battled to be the first to travel and explore space. 1960 saw the first weather satellite, which was launched from Cape Canaveral, Pioneer 5, which was to orbit between Earth and Venus, and Echo 1 enabled the first satellite call to be made. Then, in 1965, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov became the first person to walk in space after leaving his spacecraft for 12 minutes. In the same year, the US was the first country to show the world images of the Red Planet from its spacecraft Mariner 4 as it flew past Mars. In 1968, the Soviet Zond 5 was launched, and it became the first spacecraft to orbit the Moon and re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. But it was America who finally put man on the Moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spoke those famous words whilst audiences sat gripped by their TV screens the world over.
It's one small step for man.
The 60s saw a gigantic leap in the protests and demonstrations against segregation. As the decade went by, people were becoming more and more anti-establishment and stood up for what they believed in. Martin Luther King protested in Miami in 1961, while over in Berlin some 250,000 Berliners protested against the building of the Berlin Wall. In 1963, George Wallace made his inaugural speech as governor of Alabama. He famously said, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever." Meanwhile, Martin Luther King delivered his moving and poignant speech.
I have a dream.
Even though 1964 saw the US Senate passing the Civil Rights Act, American black Muslim leader Malcolm X was shot dead. He has since been described as one of the greatest and most influential African Americans in history. Race riots were still breaking out over a number of US states in 1967, and 1968 saw the assassination of Martin Luther King on April 4th at his room in the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, which did nothing but spur on another wave of riots in outrage of the murder. Those weren't the only riots that were documented during the 60s. The famous Brighton riots between the Mods and Rockers took place in 1964. Influenced by the likes of Elvis and Gene Vincent, the Rockers, who died out shortly after the '64 riots, were also known as Teddy Boys, and adopted a macho look, wearing denim jeans with turn-ups, biker boots and leathers. The Mods, which comes from the word modernist, were looked down upon by the Rockers as weedy and effeminate. They adopted a more sophisticated but much less masculine look. Choosing tailored suits and shoes made from Italian leather, they were often seen on scooters and were influenced by the likes of Rod Stewart and Mark Bolan. Modettes, the female of the subculture, were inspired by the likes of Twiggy and Sandy Shaw for their attire and hair. Mods on modettes could be seen in the shops of Carnaby Street, London, which was famed for its part in the massive fashion revolution of the decade. Inspired by bands such as The Who, The Kinks and Small Faces, mods died out fairly quickly in the mid-60s, followed by several revivals in the 70s, early 90s and the birth of Britpop, which can be seen in such bands as Oasis and Blur. Mod influences are still apparent in today's subcultures as it appears to be ever-evolving. By the late 60s, a new style of music had evolved. Psychedelica was a culture that was forming thanks to the likes of the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan, and the free love hippie lifestyle. It can be seen right across art and innovation, such as the invention of the lava lamp in 1963, and the invention of the smiley face symbol, a sign of peace and joy often displayed on a yellow background. This is still freely used in today's society in the likes of instant messaging. The use of drugs massively influenced the art of the decade, such as the pop art and psychedelic art. The use of bright primary and neon colours, bold patterns gave everything a trippy feeling. 1969 saw the birth of Woodstock Music and Art Festival, which was first held in New York between the 15th and 18th of August. It was billed as 3 Days of Peace and Music. The festival has since been introduced to the UK, and people still attend today, although there is a lot less tolerance towards the use of drugs. So there we have it, very aptly named the Swinging 60s. A huge shift in cultural and social acceptance gave birth to inventions and innovations that are still with us to this day.